Welcome to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk.
Hey everyone, it's Jenny Lisk, and this is episode 123 of the Widowed Parent Podcast. So I had such a great discussion with Barri Leiner Grant for this episode, and I would say that one of the most important takeaways from our discussion is this. Grief support comes in different forms, and it's important to understand some of the options so you can find something that feels right for you. Before we jump into my discussion with Barri, I wanted to let you guys know some updates from here. First of all, if you are a newer listener, I wanted to make sure you know about the resources available at my website, jennylisk.com. Most importantly, I have my top 10 tips for widowed parents, which you can download free at jennylisk.com/top10, JENNYLISK.com/top10. And also on my website, there are book recommendations and links to a whole bunch of other resources from around the grief world. And of course, there's a backlist now of over 100 episodes with topics for parents of younger kids and parents of teenagers, some for widowed dads specifically, although I would say that all of the episodes are designed to be for all parents. But there are some specifically geared towards widowed dads, and information about grief programs in various locations in the country, and a whole bunch of other topics as well. So you can, at my website, jennylisk.com, look at the menu for where it says Start Here, and I've made some suggestions as to places where you may want to start. And finally, Children's Grief Awareness Month is coming up in November, and I'm working hard to have my next book, which is called Widowed Parents Unite, ready by then. It's a compilation of reflections from seasoned widowed parents, and it has 52 tips to help you get through the first year. So that's all the news from here, and let's get on with the show. Support for this podcast comes from BetterHelp. You can talk with a licensed professional therapist online, anytime, anywhere. Visit betterhelp.com/widowedparent to learn more and get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/widowedparent. I hope you'll check it out. My guest today is Barri Leiner Grant. Barri is the founder of the Memory Circle, and she's joining us today from Chicago, Illinois. Barri, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, I've really been looking forward to speaking with you. And we met recently in a group of some grief professionals. So this is so great to be able to connect here.
Yes, a group of the grief professionals, I would say. It's pretty exciting to be a part of. I'm interested and excited to see what comes out of our get-togethers. And this is the first collaboration, I think, that came out of that meeting.
Yeah, so this is awesome. Yeah, and I'm very excited about that as well. So I know you've said that the story of your mother loss, which is when you were a young adult, it's why you do what you do. And you founded the Memory Circle, and you're doing a whole bunch of grief-related things. So I think we should just dive right in here. How can you tell us about the loss of your mother and how you got involved in this grief world?
Absolutely. I lost my mother, Ellen, in 1993, quite suddenly and without warning. She was an epic realtor in Monmouth County, New Jersey, where I grew up. And she said, it's just too hot to sell a house today. And she took herself to the beach club. And she sat in a beach chair, and someone tried to wake her, who was at the beach, ironically a nurse. And she realized that something was wrong when she couldn't wake my mom. The sun was setting, and she was leaving and didn't want to leave my mom the last on the beach. And she realized that my mom had suffered from an aneurysm.
Wow.
And it was, my mom's favorite place in the whole world was the beach. And she swam like a fish and was a diving instructor as a kid and teenager. And I think, if someone said what would be the perfect ending, she probably would have said 50 is probably way too soon, but it was truly remarkable and beautiful in so many ways, looking back at it. And fast forward, that was in summer, and fast forward to around the holidays when we met with my stepfather, my sister and I, and he told us she had wanted her organs donated. So they had left her on life support. And we came to find that when they went to donate the organs, that there was early stage liver cancer.
Oh,
It wasn't
wow.
something she ever could have known unless, they had examined the organs as they did. And so I think when we were trying to make sense of something so nonsensical, there was something pretty remarkable about just being in her favorite place on earth. We were quite a trio, my sister and my mom and I, and she spoke to us every day, maybe more than one time a day, and really knew the minutia of our life, was our greatest cheerleader. So for us, it really was the most unbelievable loss that you could ever imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. And you said your mom was 50 and you were how old and your sister was how old?
I was 28 and my sister was 5 years younger. I was married and she was at my wedding, and my sister was not yet married, and neither of us had kids. So, she never met any of the wonderful grandkids.
Right. Right. So squarely in that young adult stage of life for both of you.
And you don't realize until you look back. Now I'm 56 and I remember that year between 49 and 50 thinking almost daily, like, what if this is all you had? What if this is all you had?
Yeah.
That was a very interesting year for me. But I always move forward with the beauty of knowing that, we never know. And so I sort of live with the energy that she did, like she was such a doer, and last at the beach, last at the mall, gas tank always on E. She used to say, lean forward, girls, we're running on luck, because she was always doing, she was always doing. And so I feel like I live that way. And she taught us these amazing lessons about parenting and the way that she parented. But what you don't realize that you lose a lot of mothering. And I don't think until probably like this year, looking back, that I really leaned into what I call remothering. Like, you forge this crazy sense of independence and fortitude and resilience in being alone, in being motherless. And I don't think I realized that I really needed community. I needed others who'd experienced mother loss. And that was really the impetus for me to move into this work.
Yeah, fascinating. Okay. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. So you're the founder of the Memory Circle. So what's the Memory Circle?
The Memory Circle started as just a place where you could sit shoulder to shoulder with others who experience loss of any incarnation, kind of a peer group, where you could be seen and heard in your story. And it was just an opportunity to share, to listen, to exchange, and anyone was welcome, from those who had parent loss to those who were widowed, sibling loss, pet loss, divorce, anything that you deemed your personal loss. And we had live get-togethers back when we were gathering that way, in spots all over Chicago, from yoga studios to beautiful rentable party spaces, where I just believe that even as we change spaces, that there would be dynamic and interesting energy in those spaces for different people to come together. And I always say, I believe that every circle comes together for a reason. And I've watched that unfurl and circle. And so sometimes I'll bring in a medium. Sometimes I'll bring in writing exercises. Sometimes we'll do movement and breath work, meditation. So there's always different modalities that we explore in circle. And that was before I became a certified grief coach. I just opened these pure circles purely from the want and need for what I never had when I was in my grief and didn't have any of those things. And I just thought it's so easy to open a door. And I saw how impactful it was for people to know that they were not alone. And the circle began to grow. And I thought I needed to become a better, more qualified leader, if you will. So I got my grief certification through the International Coaching Federation, and then studied with leaders in the industry like Claire Bidwell Smith and David Kessler, some big names in the grief space.
Yeah, for sure.
And from all of those trainings really molded and modeled what happens in in Circle. And like I said, I believe that living with loss is what happens when grief comes our way. And there are so many ways in which we can process. Some of those are therapy and going to see a therapist, and some of those are in groups that gather, like the Memory Circle. And what I love about it is that you may hear someone else's story and just see yourself in their story and feel not alone, even if you're not one that shows up with your own to share, or you're not ready to share. Some people's loss that come to Circle, they're a little closer to their loss, or some like me have it a little further in the rearview mirror. And we sort of become a collective support for one another. And I believe so firmly how separated we are now, even though we feel like we're so together with social media. When we can gather with others in this way, I feel like there's just such a feeling of knowing that we are so much more alike than we are different, in and out of grief.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, while I'm thinking about it, about logistics, you mentioned that pre-pandemic it started in local various spots in Chicago and in and around Chicago. Is it presently still Chicago-based? Is it on Zoom? Is it open to people everywhere? How does it work logistically?
Yes, we quickly moved to Zoom as soon as the pandemic hit, and it was bigger than ever. I think when we were all feeling that incredible separation during COVID, more and more people started to gather. And then we were able to open the Circle wide internationally. And that really created incredible dynamics. And we had it at, different time zones and different kinds of circles. And I also opened up to one-on-one coaching during that time as well. So now I feel like if there's some silver lining of COVID, it taught us that we can really be anywhere together in many ways. But live circles are back, and I split time really between New York and Chicago. So I'll always promote those when I have a live event.
And do you still have virtual circles as well, or have those stopped?
Yes, virtual forever.
Okay.
Now I feel like yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Forever.
So if listeners are in and around New York or in and around Chicago, they could look up your in-person events. And if they're anywhere else, then they could check out your virtual circles.
And for some people, the virtual works really well. Some we have people come on their lunch break at their office, and they can hop in a conference room and take the time. I always say we need to make time and space to take care of our grief tending, if you will. And I think that it's great because you can really can meet from anywhere. And there's such a connection that we'll meet for, usually our grief groups will meet for, they're called Living with Loss. And we usually meet for 6 hour-and-a-half sessions over a 12-week period every other week. And they always continue on. There's always, maybe one that falls out, but like a bunch that go together. It becomes so intimate, and stories that you become part of one another's lives in these stories.
Well, and in speaking of logistics, I mean, a lot of my listeners have kids that are young enough that, getting a babysitter to go someplace would be more of an impediment to joining a group like this. So being able to do it from home is, is a nice.
Absolutely. We love when a child moves across the room, or a pet, or all welcome. We have somebody with a bird. All welcome.
Okay, cool. Great. Well, I'll make sure to put a link in the show notes to your site where people can, I'm assuming they can find the schedule and join one of the groups. So this is reminding me, there was recently a fascinating article in the Washington Post. I think the title was something like, "With therapists in short supply, group counseling offers an alternative." And I thought, wow, what a good point, right? I mean, there are therapists in most communities all around the country, and I keep hearing that they're just slammed.
Yeah, waiting lists that are very, very long. Many that refer their business to grief coaches, to people, other peer groups, peer guides, grief educators. I do think there is something special, as I said, about Circle. It's really how the model started for the Memory Circle. I think doing your homework, to me, is the best guidance that I can give you. Really learn about the leader. Is your leader a therapist? Is your leader a grief coach? Is your leader someone you can connect with? Does your leader understand your personal loss? Is there a group that's just for widows? Is there a group that's just for motherless daughters? Just dive in and see if they'll even do an intake interview. I do for all of mine. And I think that it's imperative to know how close or far away people are to their loss. If you think that circle will be enough, or if they need additional support, and what qualifications and credentials does the leader actually have?
That makes a lot of sense. Okay. I'm losing my train of thought here. I just was going to follow up on I know what it was. You mentioned some terminology. You mentioned grief coaches, you mentioned therapists. So what's a grief coach and what's the difference?
Sure. A therapist has gone to school to get many years of additional learning, and they have to do hours of continuing ed to become licensed therapists, which is different than a certified grief coach who has done hours, and in my case, pro bono hours with clients. And the other thing that I think is very different is that in coaching, much like in sport, if you will, we come up together with what you want to work on. We come up with like some kind of a plan, and I give you exercises in which you leave me, and we decide together, these are our goals. This is how we wish to move forward. I'm not saying that is in a way in which a therapist might work with you, but the dynamic is interesting. I also don't need a license in my state, so I can work over state lines. I still may someday become a licensed therapist, but I feel after my trainings that my grief, and I don't know if you feel the same way, but my grief has been the greatest educator of my life. And passing my story along and the ways in which I have found different modalities useful, and the way that I've really dug into the industry in general, I feel like I'm just ready and resource rich to help, from clients who have lost a house in a fire, again, to many who come to me because they know I'm a fellow motherless daughter.
Right. Well, and I think it's interesting. I think you mentioned earlier having studied grief specifically with Claire Bidwell Smith and David Kessler, and maybe also with Hope Edelman. And those are three real experts specifically on grief and loss, right?
And many therapists will tell you, the training that I took with Claire Bidwell Smith was all except me were therapists. And I was gratefully and thankfully in by special permission from Claire. And what I found so incredible is that many told me that they had very little grief specific training in their
master's
studies.
degree programs. Right. And that surprised me. I've heard that too. Right now I've heard that over and over again. But when I first started learning about this, you think, well, the therapist must learn everything about every topic in their training. Of course, that's impossible, right? They can't possibly be an expert in
can't go
everything.
to school that long.
Right. They'd be in school forever, not actually practicing. But it surprised me how very little grief and loss education is part of that formal program. So some therapists may have gone on and specialized in it with some other training, like you said, maybe the program you were in. But
It's
just because...
Yes, it was a continuing ed program where you could actually get hours as a therapist. And there really were quite a few who admitted that it just wasn't part of their formal training.
Right. Well, that's great that they were doing that.
It was beautiful. And one of the greatest things, again, is that her training was this beautiful exchange of minds. It was just like all of us had different backgrounds and different training, from dance therapy to art therapy to traditional family therapy. And we all came at how we might help individuals in such different ways. So again, doing your homework and asking when you meet with a therapist or a grief coach or a peer guide or whomever you choose to work with, it's good to ask them about their personal loss. I think that it's imperative, at least for me, that they have in fact experienced a loss. I think there's a certain kind of empathy that comes with that. I think anybody could teach you, if you're, anybody could listen empathically, but I think there's something about the knowing of the loss intimately that changes us forever and makes us a different kind of listener, teacher, companion along the long road of grief.
For sure. I thought it was interesting in the Washington Post article, they were talking about, groups, quote unquote, as an alternative to maybe what you think of as traditional therapy. They talked about two different types of groups, which I thought was interesting. So far, I think we've mostly been talking here about peer support groups, like the group that you run. And it also mentioned that there's something called like group therapy.
Sure.
Which seems like an interesting hybrid.
Yes. So the leader in that would probably be a licensed social worker or a therapist. But again, ask, because it's what you call it, the responsibility of, to me, the attendee to find out who is actually teaching. There's some, the good, the bad, and the ugly in between. But the interesting part that I thought of that particular article was the science around the studies that reported that group actually showed resiliency in higher levels than one-on-one. It showed, we'll have to link it in the show notes too. There were so many good science references in there and studies that really showed the outcome of people who showed up in group. And again, I think that dynamic, especially from what I see, is that it creates this like grief wisdom council, if you will, where everybody's sharing are like stories you probably would never hear. But I always believe that as we walk through life in our day-to-day, imagine if we were all wearing like some kind of crazy backpack of all of our troubles, or a t-shirt that said, widow, motherless, whatever, like the whole world, the barista, everybody you come in contact with is wearing something or carrying something heavy. And we just don't know. It's sort of this invisibility. And I think that when we come in group, we're like, oh my goodness, she's a lawyer, but every day she's dealing with this. And I can't believe she goes to work every day and also is dealing with this. Or, it's just that the duality of that we see in other people, like, wow, she's a mom and she's also dealing with this. She's however you meet these people, it's kind of a wonder. And then, again, grief tending for this hour and a half weekly, bi-weekly, and then going back to your day-to-day, but actually giving yourself the time and space and community that is so needed to not feel alone in this.
Yeah, I was just thinking about that, because one of the things I hear from my listeners a lot is that they feel very alone, that there may not be, in their personal circles, in their neighborhoods, in their kids' school community, there may not be other widowed parents that they know, and they feel alone in that. And one of the reasons I think people like Camp Widows so much, right? Because you go there and you meet all these other people and you're like, wow, I'm not actually alone. And I could see how a group experience like you're talking about could help with that as well.
Yes. And sometimes it is finding somebody that experienced the same exact loss as you or a similar loss as you, but sometimes it's something that's the polar opposite, and your empathy and your compassion for their loss somehow fosters this gorgeous resiliency, understanding, compassion in yourself that you didn't even know was there to give. And I think in that, there's sort of like this like gorgeous gratitude business that goes on when you have these people listening to your story. I mean, part of it is being seen and heard in your story. I mean, you don't walk around and say like, like raise your hand on the daily and be like, I'm a widow. Like even when someone says like, bring your, grandparents' day at school, like I would walk away like, wah, wah.
Yeah.
We don't get to do that because we don't have a grandma.
Right.
And we just created new systems. We reframe the day, like go to the teacher, ask for new rules. They just don't know.
Right, right. Well, so you mentioned being seen and heard, and that reminds me, I think you're doing something on Clubhouse. Tell us, well, first of all, tell us about Clubhouse, because some listeners may not be on it or may not be familiar with it. So what's Clubhouse and what are you doing over there?
Sure. It's an all audio app that you can download for free on your phone. It's kind of hard to imagine, but there are virtual rooms by the hundreds and thousands in any topic and every topic that you can conceive of. From NFTs, which I hopped on and learned about when those were new, to Bitcoin, and yes, even rooms about grief. So when I first joined, when it first came out a couple of years ago, during the pandemic, I thought, well, I could come on and talk about like all my old work in like the fashion industry and, like a much sexier background than like the grief space. And I thought, but if not me, then who? So there I went on and opened up this little room, and now we're 5,000 of us who
wow, 5,000.
pop in and pop onto this all audio app, which I think makes the intimacy, because it's voice only, wildly intimate and successful. I think people feel comfortable not being seen, especially when they're talking about something like this. I hear tears in the room, but I don't see them. And so they flow easily. A lot of people, quote unquote, meet, they tell their story, and then they get something called a back channel message, which is just like a direct message. And people make these incredible connections. And again, it's worldwide. So you could meet somebody across the world who wants to talk to you about crafting, like great bereavement leave policy, or I have an author on and we talk about a book, and then everybody is reading their book. It's just amazing what kind of discussions we have and how forthcoming people really are. And again, it's one of those places where I just look at humanity and think, man, we are so much more alike than we are different.
Yeah. That's really cool. I'm looking forward to joining one of your rooms coming up. And so for listeners who are sitting here thinking, wait a minute, how do 5,000 people all talk on a conference call at the same time? Or so even 50 people?
I'll explain it to you. So you could just be a listener. You really can go in like, there's like
a on the wall.
Yeah, it's kind of, there's like a section at the bottom that's kind of, if you will, like, the fly on the wall audience. And then if you wish to speak, there's a little function for hand raising, and you can come up and raise a hand and speak. In some rooms, it's kind of one to many, where it's more like, this is my TED talk on XYZ. Some are more interactive. Some will have kind of a mix of both, where it'll be kind of lecture or Q&A with an author. In my case, like if you came on, we'd chit chat about your book, and then maybe we'd open it up.
Fun.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
We would open it up to questions at the end from the audience. There's also a chat box. So much like Zoom, you could just go in the chat box, and I could also see, for people who don't feel comfortable speaking, you can also ask your question in the chat box, and we can address those too. So there's really something for everyone. And again, a lot of people in the room, it always surprises me. They say, I've never spoken on Clubhouse. This is my first time. They hear other people's stories and feel compelled to share.
Yeah.
We've gotten people who've needed support, who've come forward and said, I can't find any, suffering, and I really need some help finding somebody. It's a beautiful and interesting community, and an amazing app. It came alive on lockdown when people really needed that kind of connection. And they have put on plays. They have, there's everything. There's new music, there's contests, games. So again, it also is a beautiful place to just find community. So you do a little search, and you could easily find other parents just like yourself. You can find moms that are trying to find support while making dinner. You can find just about anything. I'm telling you, it's the most incredible thing. And it's so clever, and it's so creative, and it's free.
Yeah.
So every Thursday, probably since its inception, I joined Lisa Kendall, who's a therapeutic art coach. And we do an hour every Thursday at noon Central where we trade off prompts, where I'll give a writing prompt and then Lisa will give a therapeutic art prompt. And I'm like a stick figure artist, but I've really leaned into Lisa's prompts and found them incredible. And we go back and forth and also open it up for discussion. And quite often, even though that those aren't grief guided circles, they are hosted by the Memory Circle. But for so many people who do show up, something will come up for them using those modalities in and around their grief, and they'll share in the room. And I find it also beautiful and wondrous, like how the brain works when we open up to writing by hand, using art as therapy. It's beautiful. And like I said, it's absolutely free. And we feel like being of service that way is really important.
Yeah. Nice. Okay, good. Well, I'll put a link to Clubhouse in the show notes so people can find it. And I think you mentioned when we were talking earlier, you've got a Clubhouse 101 like cheat sheet for getting started. So I'll put that in the show notes too.
Yes. Best practice is like exactly what I learned when I first got there. I made this little cheat sheet and put it on my blog because people are like, what is Clubhouse? We're kind of afraid like, oh, another app and all of that. So yes, It has best practices and a little bit of background about what it is.
Cool. Okay. So we'll put that in the show notes. I encourage people to check that out. And well, you mentioned writing. I think that's something you're also been involved in like writing for loss. I think maybe you call it.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about that?
I credit Claire Bidwell Smith with my really leaning into this as a concept. She has a book about anxiety and grief as being a stage of grief that people were showing up at her office and saying, help, something's going on. I don't know what this is, having panic attacks. But one gentleman in particular came to her and had a interesting relationship with his father, a little bit tumultuous, and he had passed. And Claire said, well, write to him, like try to solve this through writing. First of all, there's so much juicy science about the part of the brain that we use when we write by hand, creates healing in the body, the prefrontal cortex. So when we write by hand, the same part of the brain that lets us know that we're no longer in fight or flight. It brings us to a place and space of healing and equanimity and peace. And we so rarely write by hand anymore. Just that alone is pretty interesting. But she said, create this imaginal relationship with him. The cells in our body don't know whether the person is earthly or otherwise. So try to create that connection through this and write him a letter. And I was reading it as a resource for me and for clients. And I thought, well, I have written so much about my mother. I've never written to my mother. So along I went, did the exercise and thought, this is like earth shattering. It was just amazing. So instead of kind of coming to an event, like I was saying earlier, where like grandma's day at school, where I was like an aw shucks moment would turn into, dear mom, if you could have seen Emma today at graduation, I'd invite her in through my writing. And in turn, I would really feel this amazing sense of her presence and a way of making her part of the day and part of the story. And it really was so healing. And so a lot of the work that I do in group revolves around writing prompts. Sometimes they're all writing workshops that I'll pop up like a one-off. I think people always say, well, I'm not a good writer. And I always say, if you are writing, you are a writer. So this doesn't necessarily mean that you have to go and publish a book, but using writing as a tool, as a means of communication, as a means of connection with a loved one loss is one of the biggest, most important game changers to me in my grieving process. And that book is not so old. So this came to me years and years and years after I had lost my mom. So there's always something new and there's always something I'm open to learning and trying. And that's what I tell everybody, like, try this on and see how it feels, because no two of us are exactly the same and we're not going to feel the same, even week to week, day to day, year to year. I feel like our grief morphs and changes and we morph and change with it. And that one just writing to her has been one of the most beautiful practices that I've incorporated in my grieving process.
Awesome. Okay, good. Well, thank you for telling us about that. And I'm glad you mentioned Claire Bidwell Smith's book, Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. I found it fascinating. And I'll put a link in the show notes to that, and also a link to my interview with Claire about that book, because I think listeners, will learn a lot from. And it's, the book it's not a huge tome. Like, it's just got fascinating information in very accessible format.
Yeah, and little lessons at the end, and also beautiful pauses. Like, if you feel like it's too much, you just close the book and come back. She does even her little check-in in the book and says, if you're not ready, just close it up and come back later. Yeah. It's like being with her. It really is beautiful. And like you said, it's not a lot of heavy lifting. I feel like people get caught with this big stack of how-tos by their bedside early in their grieving process, and it feels like so much. One of the things I recommend is get the audio sometimes. Sometimes the audio is just like so relaxing, and let someone tell you the story.
Yeah.
And also memoir. I think memoir is just one of the most beautiful ways of listening to someone else's story, grief story, without feeling like you're doing something right or wrong in a how-to.
Right. And we can learn something maybe from, see some of ourselves in their story, or pick up some ideas or just reflections that may be beautiful and cause us to think about whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I don't think it's something that I always recommend, and I don't think that it's a natural place for people to go. They immediately go to something that's kind of like prescriptive for like how to cure this that ails me.
Right.
And so I think the other thing that's really interesting about memoir during grief is that you really feel a sense of accomplishment. Like, you finish the book, and like you said, you make this beautiful connection, but you're like, I finished a book. It feels really good. No, it feels really good, because we have like grief brain and a little bit of fog, and we have so much to do. And sometimes if we're single parenting, like, it just feels like, oh, I'm never going to be able to get back to, that which I loved, reading or whatever other hobbies. So I feel like there's this beautiful sense of accomplishment when we finish a memoir.
Yeah. Terrific. Good. Okay. I will link to those in the show notes for sure. I know that when we talked before we started recording, you happened to mention that your sister is a widowed parent, and I think you've been supporting her. Can you tell us a little bit about what that's been like for you?
Sure. I need your advice. I always say she's like my most supportive of the circle and my most difficult client. I feel like I failed. I found it very hard to talk to her about the loss of my brother-in-law, which was ironic. I knew him very well. He was a fixture at my kitchen table since he was in high school, and a very dear friend of my sister's, and he knew my mother very well. And he died quite tragically and suddenly in an accident. And I had to write to my sister about all of the things that I was feeling, like what I wasn't sure of how to support her, but wanted very much to support her. I wasn't sure what conversation she was open to having. I wasn't certain if she preferred for me to stay out of the way. It was just, it's the first time that I've had to, I'm the older sister. It's the first time that I have to navigate sisterhood in a way that wasn't like the bossy older sister. And usually we're in such agreement, but it was hers and hers alone. So I could be there to listen and support her and support her children. And I always message her on every important occasion. I write about my brother-in-law on all the important milestones that pass. I honor him in that way. And so, but it's very difficult to guide her as I would a client. I mean, and in that regard, I would also say family members, even in the same family, everyone grieves so differently. We grieved our mother very much the same. But the way that she's grieving the loss of her husband, which you can imagine is so much different than it was losing a parent. And I don't know. I need, I've read lots of books on, other widows, and I don't see a deep connection in anything that I've read about her particular story. And I don't know whether because of it was tragic and sudden. I just don't feel like of all of the people that I know and who I love the most, that I am the most supportive there. But, I just don't know. I try to keep memories alive. That's like that's the beauty. That's the beauty of what I do. So for her children and for her, I try to make meaning of all of the occasions that we've experienced since he passed.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. And I hope
it's hard. I need you. Yeah. I need your help.
Some of the some of my listeners are grief allies, people that are supporting the friends, the family, the neighbors, the colleagues. Yeah, I hope that you sharing a little bit about that is helpful. I love how you said.
I listen to your podcast as school, because I do learn a lot, and I allow for her to be. There's nothing prescriptive that I can offer to her. I'm just very accepting, and we're moving east soon, and I'll be closer to her physically than I have been in many, many years. And I think that will just be wonderful.
Yeah. So nice. Gosh, I think we're running out of time. Before I get to my wrap-up question, I have to ask you, because I've seen that you call yourself a chief grief officer. So what is that?
Someone asked me once what I do, or what is the memory circle, or I don't know. And I said, I'm the CGO. And he was like, what's that? I said, I'm the chief grief officer. And he said, that's brilliant. And we kind of giggled about it. And I was in Clubhouse of all places, and there was a gentleman in the room who was an attorney. He brought up something about trademarking, and I messaged him and I said, do you want to make some Clubhouse history? I would love to hire you to see if this trademark is available. So it's now trademarked, and that's what I am, the CGO of my company.
Nice. That's awesome. Well, I'm glad you're able to get that. That's cool. Well, so that leads us perhaps right into some final thoughts here. As the chief grief officer, can you tell us if you could say one thing to people who maybe aren't sure if they should join a grief support group, what would you say to them?
Try it. I had no support. 1993, there was nothing, right? There were no resources. The first thing that came to me was Hope Edelman's book, Motherless Daughters. And in a way, because she had all of these essays and case studies about other women who had lost their mother, I felt as if I was part of a group. I realized that I wasn't alone. And so I would say, show up and try it. There is just so much wisdom in listening to other people's stories. As I said, I firmly believe that it is a wisdom exchange, a wisdom council. We lift one another up in just being compassionate listeners, showing up somewhere where you have these other people who are dedicated to coming together and supporting you in your grief journey, who are not doctors, who are not necessarily therapists, but are people like you trying to move through the long arc of grief.
Yeah, wisdom council. I love that. Yeah, well, so I think that's a perfect place to end then. Good. So my guest today is Barri Leiner Grant, founder of The Memory Circle. So Barri, where can listeners find you and find The Memory Circle? TheMemoryCircle.com, everywhere. At The Memory Circle on Instagram, TheMemoryCircle.com on my website, and The Memory Circle on Clubhouse. All right, terrific. Well, Barri, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you. See you soon.
I hope you enjoyed my interview with Barri Leiner Grant as much as I did. You can find show notes and all the links at widowedparentpodcast.com. Look for episode 123. And if you're finding the Widowed Parent Podcast helpful, please consider supporting the show. It's easy. Just go to buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. That's buymeacoffee.com/widowedparent. As always, thank you for listening, and until next week, remember, you've got this.
Thank you for listening to the Widowed Parent Podcast with your host, Jenny Lisk. Connect with us on social media and at widowedparentpodcast.com.